My name is Marcus Grayson, and I was 45 when this happened. It was in late September, a time when the air in Kaibab National Forest turns crisp. The light softens, and the shadows seem to grow longer. I had parked my RV deep in the woods near a remote trail called Whispering Pines. I'd come here to escape the noise of the world, to write about my years as a park ranger, and, if I'm honest, to avoid the ghosts of my own past. My wife, Celeste, passed away 3 years ago. I left my ranger position soon after and began drifting. The forest was the only place that still made sense to me. Whispering Pines, however, would prove to be something else entirely. The first few days were uneventful. I'd set up camp near a clearing, far enough from the main road that the only sounds were the wind through the pines and the occasional bird call. The solitude suited me. I spent my mornings writing, my afternoons hiking, and my evenings sipping coffee by the fire. On the third day, I met Jenny Caldwell. She showed up out of nowhere, knocking on the side of my RV just as the sun was setting. I opened the door to find a woman in her late 30s with a weathered backpack slung over her shoulder. Her car had broken down a few miles back, she explained, and she needed help. "I don't have cell service out here," I said, stepping outside to size her up. "What are you doing out here alone anyway?" Jenny looked sheepish. "I'm a journalist. I'm working on a piece about local legends, specifically the Witch of Whispering Pines." I laughed. "You came all the way out here for a ghost story?" Her smile faltered. "I didn't expect to get stranded, if that's what you mean." I agreed to let her stay the night, promising to hike out with her in the morning to look for help. As the fire crackled, she filled me in on the witch's legend. According to Jenny, the witch was a settler accused of cursing her community after a series of mysterious deaths. She was hanged beneath a large pine tree, and her spirit was said to haunt the forest, luring people to their doom with whispers. "I've spent years in the woods," I said. "It's always the wind or some animal. Ghosts don't exist." Jenny shrugged. "Maybe, but this place has a reputation." That night, as we each settled into our sleeping bags, I thought about what she'd said. I wasn't superstitious, but the woods did seem different here. Darker, quieter. The air itself felt heavy, as though the forest was holding its breath. It was the whispers that woke me. At first, I thought it was Jenny muttering in her sleep. Then I realized the sound was coming from outside the RV. Soft, indistinct voices that seemed to shift and overlap. I sat up, my heart pounding. The whispers grew louder, and then one of them said my name. "Marcus." I froze. The voice was faint but unmistakable. I reached for the flashlight by my bed, my hands shaking as I switched it on. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty clearing. The whispers stopped as suddenly as they'd started. When morning came, I told myself it had been a dream. Jenny and I set off to find help, following a narrow trail that wound through the forest. The pines loomed overhead, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. Jenny was unusually quiet, her usual curiosity replaced by a tense, watchful demeanor. "Do you hear that?" she asked suddenly, stopping in her tracks. "Hear what?" She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing. "It's like footsteps." I listened, but the only sound was the wind. "You're imagining things." She didn't look convinced. A mile into the hike, we found the footprints. They were large and bare, the toes digging deep into the soil. They didn't belong to either of us, and they hadn't been there the day before. The sight of them sent a chill down my spine. "Do you think it's a bear?" Jenny asked. "Bears don't leave tracks like this." I glanced around, suddenly aware of how quiet the forest had become. "Let's keep moving." We hadn't gone far when we came across the tree. It was an enormous pine, its bark scarred with deep grooves. Carved into the trunk was a strange symbol, two intersecting circles surrounded by jagged lines. "That's it," Jenny said, her voice hushed. "That's the mark of the Witch of Whispering Pines. You've got to be kidding me." But even as I said it, I felt a strange unease. The symbol looked old, the lines weathered but still sharp. A gust of wind rustled the branches above us, and I thought I heard a voice. "Marcus." It was faint, barely more than a whisper, but it sent a jolt of fear through me. "Did you hear that?" Jenny asked. I nodded. The storm hit that afternoon. Thunder rumbled in the distance and rain began to pour, turning the trail into a muddy mess. Our radios and phones refused to work, leaving us completely cut off. We had no choice but to return to the RV. That night, the whispers came again. They were louder this time, more insistent, and they seemed to surround the RV. I tried to ignore them, but then I heard Celeste's voice. "Marcus," she said, "I'm here." My heart clenched. It couldn't be her. It wasn't possible. And yet, it sounded just like her. I stumbled out of the RV, flashlight in hand. Jenny called after me, but I didn't stop. The whispers led me toward the tree with the carved symbol. Standing beneath it was a figure. A woman with flowing black hair and hollow eyes. Her dress was tattered, her skin pale as moonlight. "Celeste?" I whispered. The figure tilted her head, a cruel smile spreading across her face. "Stay with me, Marcus." I took a step back, the flashlight shaking in my hand. "You're not her." The woman's smile vanished, replaced by a look of rage. Shadows began to gather around her, swirling and whispering, their voices growing louder and more frenzied. I turned and ran. Jenny found me hours later, sitting in the mud near the RV. I told her everything, and to my surprise, she believed me. "She's trying to trap you," Jenny said. "She feeds on guilt, on fear. That's how the legend goes. So, how do we stop her?" Jenny didn't have an answer. The next day, Jenny disappeared. I woke to find her side of the RV empty, her pack gone. I searched the forest, calling her name, but there was no sign of her. As I approached the tree with the symbol, I saw her, standing in a trance, her eyes unfocused as the witch loomed over her. "Jenny!" I shouted. The witch turned to me, her hollow eyes burning with an unnatural light. "Leave," she growled, her voice like the creak of ancient wood. "No," I said, stepping forward. "You don't control me." She laughed, a low, chilling sound. "Do you think your defiance matters? You couldn't save her, Marcus. You couldn't save Celeste." The mention of my wife's name brought a surge of anger. "You're right," I said. "I couldn't save her, but I'm not letting you take Jenny." The witch hesitated, her form flickering like a dying flame. I grabbed Jenny and pulled her away from the tree. The shadows swirled around us, but their grip was weaker now, less certain. "Go," I whispered to Jenny. "Run." We didn't stop until we reached the trailhead. When I looked back, the witch was gone, her form dissolving into the mist. Jenny and I left the forest the next morning. We didn't talk much during the drive back to civilization. I think we both knew that what we'd experienced wasn't something words could easily explain. As I parked my RV and prepared to say goodbye, Jenny placed a hand on my shoulder. "Thank you," she said, "for not giving up." I nodded, though the guilt still lingered. I hadn't been able to save Celeste, but maybe, just maybe, I'd found some small redemption. I haven't been back to Kaibab National Forest since. The Witch of Whispering Pines is still out there, I'm sure of it, waiting for her next victim. But she won't find me among them. I've had enough ghosts for one lifetime. My name is Ellie Clark, and I was 26 when I decided to spend a week camping in the Superstition Mountains. This happened in 2021, during October, when the desert nights were cooler and the air seemed alive with stories. I had parked my RV at Lost Dutchman State Park, right at the edge of the wilderness. I was here to chase ghosts, or, more specifically, the ghost stories surrounding the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. I run a blog called Wandering Spirits, where I write about haunted places and local legends. My readers love spooky tales, and the Superstition Mountains were steeped in them. The stories about the cursed mine, prospectors who vanished, and strange lights in the mountains were exactly the kind of content I needed. What I didn't realize was how real those stories could become. The first day was uneventful, except for the heat. I'd planned a hike along the Prospector's View Trail, and though I'd packed plenty of water, I underestimated how dry the air would feel. By the time I got back to my RV, my mouth felt like sandpaper and my legs were screaming. I was too tired to explore much further, so I spent the evening reading up on local legends by lantern light. The air grew cold as the sun set. I stood outside for a while, staring up at the jagged silhouette of the Superstition Mountains. They were beautiful, but there was something unnerving about the way they loomed, their sharp peaks cutting into the twilight sky. As darkness fell, the wind began to whisper through the scrub, carrying with it the faint sound of clinking metal. At first, I thought it was the RV settling or a loose piece of equipment rattling in the breeze. But the sound grew more rhythmic, like a pickaxe striking stone. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the trailhead. Nothing. Just the desert, vast and empty. I told myself it was my imagination. I'd been reading too many ghost stories. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The next day, I met Nate Hargrove, the park ranger. He was in his 60s, wiry and weathered like the desert itself. I ran into him while refilling my water bottles at the visitor center. When I told him about my plans to explore the legends of the mine, he gave me a look that was equal parts amusement and concern. "Ghost stories are fun," he said, "but this place doesn't play nice with people who don't respect it. Stay on the marked trails, keep your wits about you, and don't go looking for trouble." "I can handle myself," I replied, though his tone made me uneasy. He shrugged. "Suit yourself, just don't end up like the others." "Others?" I pressed. He sighed. "Over the years, we've had folks come here looking for the Lost Dutchman's gold mine. They either come back empty-handed or don't come back at all. This land, it's got a way of keeping secrets." I nodded politely, but his words lingered. That evening, the strangeness began in earnest. As I sat outside my RV, writing notes for my blog, I heard footsteps in the sand. At first, I thought it was another camper, but when I looked around, there was no one. Just the faint outline of boot prints leading away from my campsite toward the mountains. I followed the prints for a short distance before stopping myself. I'd left my flashlight behind, and the desert at night wasn't a place to wander blindly. Still, as I turned back, I heard a voice, a faint, gravelly whisper. "Find me." I froze. The voice was so soft I couldn't be sure I'd heard it. Heart pounding, I hurried back to my RV and locked the door. I tried to convince myself it was the wind or my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. The next day, I hiked further into the mountains, determined to see the area where prospectors supposedly vanished. The desert was vast and harsh, the sun blazing down on the rocky trails. By the time I reached the viewpoint, I was drenched in sweat and out of breath. I stood there, staring out at the rugged expanse of the Superstitions, and felt a strange pull, like the land itself was calling me. That's when I saw it. A faint glow in the distance, like a lantern swaying back and forth. It was too bright to be a trick of the sun and too far off the trail to be another hiker. Curiosity overpowered my caution, I followed the light, weaving through cacti and scrub until I came to a cluster of blackened rocks. The glow disappeared, but something else caught my eye. A rusted pickaxe embedded in the ground. I crouched down, brushing away the dirt. The metal was corroded, but it looked old, really old. As I examined it, the faint smell of smoke filled the air. When I looked up, the lantern glow was back, hovering just beyond the next ridge. I didn't follow it this time. Something about it felt wrong. That night, the miner came to me. I was inside the RV, trying to review the photos I'd taken of the pickaxe, when the temperature dropped suddenly. My breath fogged the air and the lights flickered. Then, through the window, I saw him. He stood at the edge of my campsite, his figure barely visible in the faint moonlight. He was gaunt and weathered, dressed in tattered mining clothes. His face was shadowed beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but his lantern glowed bright, casting an eerie light over the ground. "Find me," he whispered again, though his mouth didn't move. His voice was like gravel scraping against stone. My hands were shaking as I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and began walking toward the mountains, his lantern swaying. Against every instinct, I followed him. He led me to an unmarked trail I hadn't noticed before. The ground was uneven, littered with stones and debris. As I climbed higher, the air grew colder, and the glow of his lantern flickered in and out of sight. Finally, he stopped in front of a narrow cave entrance. Without a word, he pointed inside. "What's in there?" I asked, but he was already gone, his lantern light fading into the darkness. The cave smelled of damp earth and decay. I hesitated, then stepped inside, using my flashlight to guide the way. The walls were jagged, the floor uneven, but the faint glint of something metallic caught my eye. Gold nuggets scattered among the rocks. My heart raced. I'd found it, the lost Dutchman's gold. But as I reached for one of the nuggets, the air grew heavy, and the sound of a pickaxe striking stone echoed through the cave. I spun around, and there he was, standing at the entrance. His face was no longer shadowed. It was hollow and skeletal, his empty eye sockets burning with an otherworldly light. "Leave," he growled, his voice booming. The walls of the cave seemed to tremble, loose stones falling around me. I stumbled backward, dropping the gold. "I'm sorry," I shouted. "I didn't mean to." Before I could finish, he raised his pickaxe and swung. The blade missed me by inches, striking the wall with a deafening crack. Rocks began to fall, blocking the entrance. Panicked, I scrambled through the debris, narrowly escaping as the cave collapsed behind me. When I looked back, the entrance was gone, buried beneath a mountain of stone. I didn't sleep that night. The handprint on my RV windshield the next morning was the final warning. Written in the dust were 3 words: "Leave us alone." I packed up and left Lost Dutchman State Park without looking back. I don't know if anyone will believe my story, but I'll never forget the miner's ghost or the glow of his lantern. Some legends are meant to stay buried. My name is Jake Rivera, and I was 32 when it happened. This was back in 2021, in the heart of the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest. I had planned the trip as a challenge, a chance to test myself and maybe kickstart a solo survivalist vlog series. I never imagined it would leave me with nightmares and scars that time hasn't healed. I was joined by 2 friends, Maya Perez, 29, and Aaron Blackwell, 35. Maya was a bright spark, all optimism and jokes, though she lacked experience in the wilderness. Aaron, a photographer, was her opposite, quiet, brooding, and hard to read. He had a knack for seeing beauty in shadows and silence. Maybe that's what drew him to the forest. We set off in my beat-up RV on a cold October morning, aiming for the Black River Trail. This wasn't just any trail. It was remote, winding through pine forests and canyons few dared to traverse. Perfect for getting away from the world. The first day was uneventful. We parked the RV at a primitive campsite near the trailhead and hiked a short loop to get our bearings. Maya struggled with her brand new hiking boots, complaining about blisters by the time we returned to camp. Aaron spent most of the day fiddling with his camera gear, lugging it around like it was an extension of his soul. I chalked up the tension in the group to early jitters. We'd settle in, I thought. We always did. The second day, things began to go wrong. Maya woke up complaining about a nightmare, a dream where she was being chased through the forest by something she couldn't see. She laughed it off over breakfast, but I noticed the tremor in her voice. I didn't say anything. That morning, we set out on the Black River Trail. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue, but the forest felt different, too quiet. The usual chatter of birds and rustling leaves was absent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Maya noticed it too. "Do you hear that?" she asked, stopping mid-hike. "Hear what?" I said, though I already knew what she meant. It was the lack of sound that had my skin crawling. Aaron shrugged. "It's the wind," he muttered, but even he seemed uneasy. Halfway through the hike, Aaron stopped to photograph a cluster of twisted, blackened trees. They looked like they'd been scorched in a fire, though there hadn't been one in this area for years. As he framed his shot, I caught a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye, something pale and humanoid darting between the trees. "Did you see that?" I asked, spinning toward the direction of the movement. "See what?" Aaron didn't look up from his camera, but Maya was scanning the tree line, her face pale. "It was nothing," I said quickly, not wanting to spook her. But my gut told me otherwise. We returned to camp late that afternoon, our legs aching and nerves frayed. That's when we found the deer carcass. It was sprawled near the edge of the campsite, its body twisted in ways that didn't seem possible. Its rib cage was exposed, flesh stripped clean, but there wasn't a drop of blood anywhere. "Mountain lion," I said, though I didn't believe it. Maya looked like she was about to throw up. Aaron knelt beside the carcass, snapping photos like it was a macabre art installation. "Don't touch it," I warned, but Aaron ignored me. He was too focused, too fascinated. That night, as we sat around the campfire, the forest seemed to close in around us. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves. Every sound made us jump. Then came the whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind, a faint, almost melodic hum that drifted through the trees, but as it grew louder, I realized it wasn't random. It was a voice, low and guttural, calling my name. "Jake!" I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. Maya and Aaron heard it too. I could see it in their wide, terrified eyes. "What the hell was that?" Maya whispered. "I don't know," I said, reaching for the hatchet I'd brought with me. "Probably just the wind." But we all knew it wasn't. The next morning, we decided to leave. The forest had turned against us, and none of us wanted to stick around to find out why. But the RV wouldn't start. The engine sputtered and died, no matter how many times I turned the key. "That's not possible," I muttered, popping the hood. The battery was fine, the fuel tank was full. There was no reason it shouldn't be working. Aaron was pacing nervously, clutching his camera. "We should hike out," he said, "find a ranger station." "It's a 6-hour hike to the nearest station," I said. "And if we leave the RV, we lose all our supplies." Maya looked between us, her face pale. I don't want to stay here another night. Neither did I. But we had no choice. That night was worse. The whispers returned, louder this time, circling the RV like a predator stalking its prey. The air inside grew heavy, suffocating, and the temperature plummeted. Then came the growling, a deep, guttural sound that rattled the windows. Something slammed against the side of the RV. Once. Twice. The whole vehicle rocked. I grabbed the hatchet and opened the door, stepping into the cold night. The fire had burned out, leaving the campsite bathed in shadows. At the edge of the clearing stood a figure, impossibly tall and gaunt, its eyes glowing like embers in the dark. Its face was a grotesque mask of twisted flesh and hollow sockets. It didn't move, but I could feel its hunger, a primal, all-consuming need that made my blood run cold. "Get back inside," Maya screamed, and I obeyed, slamming the door shut and locking it. We didn't sleep. The creature circled the RV all night, its growls and whispers never ceasing. By dawn, we were out of options. "We hike," I said. "Now." Aaron hesitated, but Maya didn't need convincing. She grabbed her pack, wincing as she put weight on her swollen ankle. I hated leaving the RV behind, but it was our only chance. The hike was a nightmare. The creature followed us, always just out of sight but never far enough to forget. It left carcasses along our path, mutilated rabbits, birds, and even a coyote. Each one was more grotesque than the last. Maya was slowing down, limping badly, but she refused to stop. Aaron was quiet, clutching his camera like a lifeline. Then, as we neared a narrow canyon, the creature struck. It came out of nowhere, a blur of pale limbs and hollow eyes. It was fast, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Before I could react, it was on Aaron, dragging him into the trees. "Aaron!" Maya screamed. But it was too late. His screams echoed through the forest, then stopped abruptly. "We have to go," I said, grabbing Maya's arm and pulling her forward. She was sobbing, her face streaked with tears, but she kept moving. We reached the ranger station just as the sun rose, our bodies battered and our minds broken. The ranger didn't believe us, of course. He said Aaron was probably attacked by a bear, that we were lucky to be alive. But his eyes told a different story. He'd heard something like this before. We never found Aaron's body. His camera was recovered weeks later, but the footage was corrupted, the images distorted beyond recognition. Maya and I haven't spoken since. I don't think either of us knows how to process what happened. All I know is that I'll never set foot in that forest again. Some things are better left forgotten. My name is Michael Randall, and I was 37 years old when this happened. It was the middle of October, just after my divorce was finalized. I'd been living in my RV, driving aimlessly across Arizona, trying to escape the suffocating monotony of my old life. That's how I ended up in Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, parked off a narrow logging road that didn't even show up on my GPS. The forest was breathtaking, the kind of place that seemed to stretch on forever. Pine trees loomed over me like sentinels, their branches swaying gently in the crisp autumn breeze. It was quiet, too quiet maybe, but that's exactly what I was looking for. Solitude. I parked my RV in a small clearing and stepped outside to stretch. The gravel crunched beneath my boots as I surveyed the area. The plan was simple. Camp for a couple of days, clear my head, and maybe figure out my next steps. But plans don't mean much when the devil himself decides to intervene. The first sign that something was off came about an hour after I arrived. I'd just finished setting up my campfire when I noticed someone walking toward me from the trail. She appeared out of nowhere, a slim figure with dark hair and a faded denim jacket. "Hey," she called out, her voice light but oddly flat. "Mind if I join you for a bit?" Normally, I wouldn't have invited a stranger into my campsite, but Something about her felt disarming. She introduced herself as Ruby and claimed her car had broken down a few miles back. "I'm trying to get to my family's cabin," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the forest. "But it's too far to walk tonight. Mind if I camp here?" I hesitated. Something about her didn't add up. No backpack, no gear, but I couldn't exactly send her into the woods alone. "Sure," I said. "I've got extra firewood." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Thanks. You're a lifesaver." As night fell, Ruby and I sat by the fire, the orange flames dancing between us. She wasn't much of a talker, but when she did speak, her words carried a strange weight. "This forest is different," she said, staring into the fire. "It's not like other places." "How so?" I asked, half listening as I poked at the embers. She shrugged. "It's old. It remembers things, and it doesn't like visitors." I chuckled nervously. "Well, good thing I'm not planning to stick around too long." She didn't laugh. Instead, she leaned closer, her expression unreadable. "You ever hear of the Grinning Devil?" I shook my head, and she told me the story. Decades ago, loggers worked these woods, cutting trees and building roads where none had existed before. One day, a man appeared, tall, shadowy, with a grin that stretched too wide. He offered them wealth and power, promising they'd never want for anything again. All they had to do was sign his book. "And did they?" I asked. She nodded. One by one, and one by one, they vanished. Some say you can still hear their laughter if you listen close enough. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Sounds like a campfire story. Ruby's gaze flicked toward the trees, her eyes narrowing. "It's more than that." That night, I woke to the sound of whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind slipping through the trees, but then I heard it again, soft, low, unmistakable. "Mike?" I sat up in my bunk, heart pounding. The fire outside had burned down to embers, casting faint shadows across the clearing. Ruby's silhouette was visible through the RV window. She was standing just outside, staring into the darkness. I stepped outside, the cold biting at my skin. "Ruby, what are you doing?" She didn't turn around. "Do you hear it?" "Hear what?" She finally looked at me, her face pale and drawn. "The laughter." And then I heard it, a deep, guttural chuckle that echoed through the trees, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. The next morning, I found them. Strange symbols carved into the dirt around my RV. They were crude, circular, and vaguely unsettling, like something out of a witch's spell book. I crouched down to get a closer look, but I couldn't make sense of them. Ruby appeared behind me, startling me. "Don't touch them." "Why not?" I asked, trying to keep the irritation out of my voice. "They're warnings," she said. "He's coming." "Who's coming?" I snapped, my patience wearing thin. She didn't answer. Instead, she walked back to the fire pit and sat down, muttering something under her breath. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a strange heaviness settle over the forest. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should. Ruby sat by the fire, her knees drawn to her chest, while I paced nervously. And then he appeared. At first, it was just a figure in the distance, standing at the edge of the clearing. But as he stepped closer, the firelight revealed his features, or lack thereof. His face was shadowed, his grin impossibly wide, stretching from ear to ear. His eyes glowed faintly, like embers in a dying fire. "Good evening," he said, his voice smooth and unsettling. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ruby didn't move, didn't even look at him. I, on the other hand, felt rooted to the spot, my mouth dry and my heart hammering in my chest. "Who are you?" I managed to choke out. He tilted his head, his grin never wavering. "Just a humble businessman, and I think you, Michael, could use my services." He stepped closer, his movements fluid and unnatural. "I've been watching you. Such a shame about your marriage, and that job you hate so much. Wouldn't you like to change it all, start fresh?" I glanced at Ruby, but she wouldn't meet my eyes. "What are you talking about?" I demanded. The devil chuckled. "I'm offering you a deal. Wealth, power, happiness, whatever your heart desires. All I need is a little signature." He produced a leather-bound book from thin air, holding it out to me. I stared at it, feeling a strange pull, like the very fabric of reality was bending around me. "No," I said, my voice trembling. "I'm not interested." The grin widened, impossibly, grotesquely. "Oh, but you are. Everyone is." Ruby finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mike, don't. He's lying." The devil's gaze shifted to her, and for the first time, her composure cracked. "Ruby," he said, almost affectionately. "Still playing the victim, I see." "What's going on?" I demanded, stepping away from both of them. Ruby's eyes filled with tears. I brought you here. He needs someone to take my place. It's the only way I can leave." "You what?" My stomach turned as the realization hit me. "You used me?" "I didn't have a choice," she sobbed. "Please, Mike, don't sign it. Don't let him win." The devil sighed, his grin faltering for the first time. Enough of this. With a wave of his hand, the fire roared to life, casting a harsh, flickering light over the clearing. The symbols around the RV glowed faintly, pulsing with an otherworldly energy. "You're wasting my time, Michael," he said, his voice sharp and commanding. "Sign the book, or Ruby will take your place forever." I looked at Ruby, then back at the devil. My mind raced, searching for a way out. And then I remembered the salt. I grabbed the container of salt from my supplies and began pouring it in a circle around myself. The devil laughed, a horrible, mocking sound, but I didn't stop. The moment the circle was complete, he recoiled, his grin twisting into a snarl. "Clever," he hissed, "but it won't save you forever." The ground shook, and the laughter grew louder, reverberating through the forest. Ruby screamed as the devil's shadow enveloped her, dragging her into the darkness. And then, just like that, it was over. I left the forest at first light, driving my RV as far and as fast as it would go. But even now, weeks later, I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching, waiting for another chance to make his offer. The devil always grins, and I'll never forget it. My name is Megan Harper, and I was 29 years old when this happened. It was late August, the kind of dry, stifling Arizona summer that makes you appreciate every patch of shade. I'm a wildlife biologist, and at the time, I was obsessed with documenting a rare species of bat rumored to nest deep within Sycamore Canyon wilderness. The area was remote, rugged, and, according to the locals, dangerous for reasons that had nothing to do with wildlife. I didn't buy into the stories. Legends about skinwalkers, witches, or strange creatures sounded like fairy tales to me. But my hiking partner, Eli Grant, thought differently. Eli was 32, a park ranger with a calm demeanor and an almost unnerving belief in the supernatural. When I mentioned my plans to explore Sycamore Canyon, he insisted on coming along. "Not for you," he'd said, his voice low and serious. "For me. That place has a history." The third member of our group was Paige Turner, my childhood friend. Paige was 26, full of enthusiasm and reckless optimism. She wasn't there for the bats or the legends. She wanted to capture the beauty of the canyon for her nature blog. It was her first time in such a remote area, and she treated it like a casual camping trip. Haunted or not, she joked, this place is going to make me famous. We planned a 3-day trek. The goal was to reach a cave system on the second day, spend the night there while I recorded the bats, and hike back on the third. Eli had warned us the terrain would be grueling, but I hadn't realized just how unrelenting the canyon was. By midday, the sun seemed to press down on us like a weight, and the steep inclines tested our stamina at every step. It was late afternoon when we reached our first campsite near a dry creek bed. We were exhausted, the air heavy with the scent of pine and dust. As I set up the tents, Eli stood at the edge of the clearing, staring into the trees. "Something wrong?" I asked. He shook his head but didn't look away. "Just keeping an eye out." "For what?" He hesitated. "Tracks, maybe. This place has been quiet, too quiet." I rolled my eyes. "You're making something out of nothing." But as the sun dipped below the canyon walls, I started to notice it too. The silence wasn't natural. There were no crickets chirping, no rustling of small animals in the underbrush. Just an oppressive stillness that made my skin crawl. That night, we built a fire and sat close, the flames casting flickering shadows across the trees. Paige was snapping photos with her camera, excitedly narrating every shot for her blog. Eli, as usual, was quiet, his eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. It wasn't until we were lying in our tents that I heard it, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. My name. "Megan." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. "Eli Paige?" No answer. Just the whisper again, softer this time as if it were inside my head. I unzipped the tent and peered out. The fire was still burning low, casting an orange glow over the campsite. Eli was sitting by the fire, wide awake. "You heard it too, didn't you?" he asked, without looking at me. I swallowed hard. "Heard what?" He finally turned, his expression grim. "Your name." The next morning, we found the tracks. Deep, claw-like impressions in the dirt near the creek bed, forming a strange circular pattern. Paige crouched down to take a photo, her earlier excitement now replaced with unease. "Bear?" she asked, glancing at Eli. He shook his head. "Bears don't walk in circles." I knelt beside him, studying the tracks. They were too large for any known predator in the area, and the spacing between them suggested a creature that walked on 2 legs. But the claws, they were impossibly long, like something out of a nightmare. "It's just some kind of prank," I said, more to convince myself than anyone else. "Someone messing with hikers." Eli didn't respond. He simply stood and started packing up camp. By the time we reached the cave system on the second day, the atmosphere had shifted. Paige was unusually quiet, and even I found myself scanning the forest for movement, feeling eyes on me that I couldn't see. The cave loomed ahead, its entrance a gaping maw in the rock. The air inside was cool, damp, and smelled faintly of rot. "This is it," I said, trying to sound cheerful. "The perfect spot to record the bats." Eli nodded, but stayed near the entrance, his hand resting on the handle of the hunting knife strapped to his belt. Paige followed me in, her camera light illuminating the walls. I set up my equipment near a narrow crevice where I could hear the faint rustling of wings. "Paige, take a few shots of the opening," I said. "The lighting here is great." She didn't respond. When I turned, she was staring at the camera screen, her face pale. "What is it?" I asked. She handed me the camera. The photo she'd taken showed a shadowy figure standing at the cave entrance, tall, gaunt, with glowing eyes. But when I looked back, there was nothing there. "We need to leave," Paige whispered, her voice trembling. I wanted to argue, but Eli's shout from outside cut me off. "Megan! Paige! Get out here!" We ran to the entrance and froze. The tracks were back, circling the cave in a deliberate pattern, and standing at the edge of the trees was a figure, impossibly tall, its limbs unnaturally long. It was watching us. We left the cave in a hurry, hiking as fast as we could without speaking. The figure followed, always just out of sight. Its presence felt more than seen. As dusk fell, the whispers returned, louder now, overlapping and distorted. They called out in our voices, mimicking our tones and inflections perfectly. "Megan, wait!" "Eli, over here!" "Paige, don't leave me!" It was maddening, and the fear was suffocating. Paige tripped on a rock and fell, scraping her hands and knees. I helped her up, but the delay cost us. The figure was closer now, its movements jerky and unnatural like a puppet on strings. Eli pulled a bundle of sage from his pack and lit it, the acrid smoke filling the air. "Stay close to me," he ordered, "and don't stop moving." We reached a small clearing just as the sun disappeared entirely, plunging the canyon into darkness. Eli knelt in the center, using the fire starter to ignite another bundle of sage. He sprinkled ash from our campfire in a wide circle around us and muttered something under his breath. "What are you doing?" I demanded. "Protecting us," he said. "Just stay inside the circle." The whispers grew louder, deafening now as the figure appeared at the edge of the clearing. It howled, a sound that rattled my bones, and stepped forward, only to recoil as it reached the ash. It paced back and forth, its glowing eyes locked on us, its shape shifting from man to coyote to something grotesque and unrecognizable. Paige was crying, clutching my arm. "What is that thing?" "Skinwalker," Eli said grimly, or something like it. The creature circled us for what felt like hours, testing the barrier, its movements growing more frantic. I could feel its rage, a palpable energy that made my skin crawl. But the ash held, and eventually, the whispers faded, replaced by the eerie silence of the canyon. At dawn, we gathered our gear and fled, leaving behind everything that wouldn't fit in our packs. The creature didn't follow us, but I could feel its presence, a lingering weight that didn't lift until we were back at the trailhead. Back home, Paige deleted the photos. She refused to talk about what happened and stopped blogging altogether. Eli filed a vague report with the Park Service, leaving out the supernatural details. As for me, I told myself it was all in my head, a product of stress and exhaustion. But sometimes, late at night, I hear it, the whisper of my name, faint and distorted, and I know it's still out there waiting. My name is Garrett Nolan, and I'm 39 years old. This happened last fall in the depths of the Coconino National Forest, Arizona, along a secluded trail called Dark Hollow. I was out there alone, investigating local myths for a history paper I was writing. At the time, I thought it was just another camping trip, a chance to prove that legends are just stories we tell to entertain ourselves. I've been a skeptic my whole life, but what I saw out there, what I felt, shattered that skepticism forever. I arrived at Dark Hollow on a crisp October morning, driving my beat-up RV down a winding dirt road. The forest was gorgeous, towering pines stretching toward the sky, their shadows long and inviting. The air was clean, with a faint chill that hinted at the coming winter. Perfect conditions for camping. The ranger station at the trailhead was empty except for one person, an older man named Bill. His uniform was slightly rumpled, and he had the wary, weathered look of someone who spent too much time alone in the woods. "You're headed to Dark Hollow?" he asked, peering at me like I'd grown a second head. "Yep," I replied, pulling my hiking pack from the RV. "Just going to check out the ruins people keep talking about. You know, the stone altar and all that." Bill's frown deepened. "Listen, folks out here don't go near Dark Hollow after sundown. It's easy to get turned around, and there are stories." "Stories like witches?" I said with a grin. I'd done my research. Supposedly, centuries ago, women accused of witchcraft had conducted rituals in the forest. When settlers drove them out, they cursed the land. "Something like that," Bill muttered. "Just stay on the main trail and be back before dark." I thanked him and set off, shaking my head. Superstitions. That's all it was. The trail started off easy, well-maintained and marked with wooden signs. I followed it for a few miles, taking notes and snapping photos. As I got deeper into the forest, the landscape changed. The trees grew thicker, the sunlight dimmer. Shadows stretched long across the trail, and the air took on an eerie stillness. That's when I found the first witch's circle. It was a patch of blackened earth, perfectly round, with a charred bone scattered at the center. I knelt to get a closer look, trying to determine if the bones were animal or human. They were brittle and weathered, but something about them felt off. Around the edge of the circle, strange symbols were etched into the dirt. They didn't match any Native American patterns I'd studied. I took photos, my curiosity outweighing my unease. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. By late afternoon, I found what I'd been looking for, a stone altar half buried under moss and fallen leaves. It was crudely constructed with deep grooves carved into its surface. Around it were more symbols, similar to the ones at the witch's circle. As I ran my fingers over the carvings, a chill ran down my spine. The air around the altar felt colder, heavier. I pulled out my camera to document the sight, but the device refused to turn on. My compass, too, was acting strange, its needle spinning wildly. Then I heard it. Soft singing carried on the wind. The voice was faint and melodic, but there was something unnatural about it. I scanned the forest, but I couldn't see anyone. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. The singing stopped. That night, I set up camp near the trailhead, close enough to the RV to feel secure, but far enough to still feel immersed in the wilderness. As the fire crackled, I reviewed my notes by flashlight. The symbols bothered me. They didn't match any historical records, yet they felt deliberate, purposeful. I was just about to call it a night when the singing started again. This time, it was closer. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it toward the trees, but the beam seemed to die in the darkness. The voice grew louder, more rhythmic. It sounded like a woman's voice, but there were layers to it, like multiple people were singing in unison. "Who's out there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The singing stopped abruptly, replaced by silence so thick it pressed against my ears. The next morning, I found wet footprints leading from the edge of the forest to my RV. Barefoot, human-sized, and impossibly fresh. My stomach churned as I examined them. There hadn't been any rain. There was no reason for the ground to be wet. I packed up quickly and decided to explore further down the trail, determined to find answers. Along the way, I discovered another witch's circle, this one with fresh markings, melted candles, small animal bones, and a bloodied piece of cloth tied to a branch. "This is getting out of hand," I muttered, snapping more photos. But deep down I felt a growing unease. Someone, or something, was out here with me. The third night was the worst. I was asleep in the RV when I woke up to the sound of a low, rhythmic hum. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on it. I tried to sit up, but I couldn't move. Panic set in as my eyes darted around the dim interior of the RV. Then I saw it. A figure stood in the doorway, barely visible in the darkness. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. Its face was hidden in shadow, but I could feel its gaze, cold, piercing, and inhuman. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my skull. I squeezed my eyes shut, praying it would go away. When I opened them again, the figure was gone, and the RV was silent. By the fourth day, I was unraveling. Exhausted and paranoid, I decided to confront the source of the singing once and for all. That evening, I followed the sound into the forest, flashlight in hand. It led me deeper than I'd ever gone, the trail fading into nothingness. I emerged into a clearing, bathed in an unnatural glow. At its center stood a group of shadowy figures, women with distorted, elongated features. They moved in a slow, ritualistic dance, their voices weaving together in an eerie chant. For a moment, I was frozen, unable to look away. Then one of them turned toward me. Its face was featureless, a blank canvas of pale flesh. The others followed, their movements jerky and unnatural. Fear propelled me backward, but as I turned to run, I stumbled into a witch's circle. The ground beneath me felt ice cold, and my vision blurred. I saw flashes of the past, women in long dresses performing rituals, settlers with torches driving them out, the forest ablaze. Then I heard the curse, a chorus of voices vowing vengeance on anyone who disturbed their land. I snapped back to reality to find the figures closing in, their chants rising to a deafening crescendo. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. My body moved on autopilot, driven by pure terror. The figures followed, their shadows stretching impossibly long under the moonlight. I scrambled into the RV and locked the door, fumbling with the keys. The engine wouldn't start. Desperate, I grabbed a small Native American charm I'd bought at a roadside stand earlier in the trip. Holding it up, I shouted, "Leave me alone." To my astonishment, the figures stopped. They lingered at the edge of the clearing, their blank faces turned toward me. Then, one by one, they melted into the shadows. The engine roared to life, and I didn't look back as I sped away. It's been weeks since that night, and I still can't shake the feeling that something followed me home. My dreams are plagued by visions of the chanting women, their distorted faces watching me from the darkness. And last night, I found symbols etched into the side of my RV, symbols that weren't there before. The forest doesn't forget, and I'm starting to believe it doesn't forgive either. My name is Eliza Reyes, and I'm 28 years old. This happened in June of 2023 when I was camping alone at Oak Flat Campground, Arizona. I'm a wildlife biologist, and my work often takes me to remote places, but this was different. I wasn't just out here to study bats, I was out here to get away. From people, from noise, from everything. I never expected the quiet to become my enemy. I parked my RV at the farthest end of the campground, where the dense trees blocked most of the view of the road. That's how I liked it, isolated. I had a week's worth of food, my research equipment, and a reliable generator. My plan was simple. Document nocturnal bat activity, collect data, and immerse myself in nature. The first day went smoothly. I hiked out to a nearby cave where I knew bats roosted, set up motion sensors, and left audio recorders to capture echolocation calls. The forest was alive with the rustle of leaves and the chatter of birds. I felt at home. That night, as I sat outside my RV with a cup of tea, the forest quieted in a way that felt unnatural. It wasn't just the usual nighttime hush. It was total silence, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. Then I heard it. Faint crying somewhere in the distance. At first, I thought it was an animal. Coyotes can make sounds that mimic human cries, but this was different. It was a child sobbing, soft and broken, carried on the wind. It came from deep within the trees, far beyond where any other campers were. I told myself it was my imagination, or maybe just an echo of someone else's campfire tales, and went to bed. The next morning, I shook off the unease and focused on my work. I hiked out to retrieve the audio recorders, but when I played them back, something was wrong. The recordings were full of interference, static, whispers, and strange, faint wails. At first, I thought it was a technical glitch, but the cries sounded eerily similar to what I'd heard the night before. Back at my campsite, I met another camper, a guy named David. He had parked his van a few spots away and seemed friendly enough. He was an amateur historian, traveling the Southwest to document local legends and myths. "Did you hear crying last night?" I asked, hoping for a rational explanation. He looked at me, his expression serious. "You heard it too?" "What is it?" I asked, half expecting him to laugh and tell me it was a coyote. Instead, he said, "Have you heard about Jonah?" I hadn't, so he told me. Jonah was a boy who had lived here in the early 1900s, back when settlers were carving out homesteads in the area. According to legend, his family had unknowingly built their home on an Apache burial ground. One night, Jonah vanished. Some said the spirits of the land took him as punishment. Others claimed his parents did something unspeakable. Either way, people have reported hearing a child crying in these woods ever since. I laughed nervously, brushing it off. "It's just a story." "Maybe," David said, but his tone suggested otherwise. That night, the crying returned, louder and more persistent. It started just after midnight, drifting through the trees like a siren's call. I stayed inside the RV, telling myself it was nothing, but when I woke the next morning, I found something that chilled me to the bone. Small, muddy handprints on my windshield. I froze, staring at them. They were unmistakably child-sized, with long streaks as if fingers had dragged across the glass. My heart pounded as I wiped them away, hoping I could also erase the fear creeping into my chest. When I told David, he wasn't surprised. "It's Jonah," he said simply. "That's ridiculous," I snapped. "It's probably just some prank." David gave me a knowing look. "You don't believe that." I didn't. That evening, I saw him. I was sitting by the fire staring into the flames when I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I turned, and there he was. A boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, standing at the edge of the trees. He wore old-fashioned clothes, the kind you'd see in black and white photos, and his face was streaked with dirt and tears. "Hello?" I called, standing up. "Are you lost?" He didn't answer. He just stared at me, his eyes hollow and glassy. Then he turned and walked into the trees. I grabbed my flashlight and followed, calling out, "Wait, I can help you." But when I reached the spot where he had been, he was gone. The forest was empty and the air was still. The next day, David and I decided to investigate. "If it's Jonah, maybe there's a reason he's still here," David said. "Ghosts are tied to places or objects. We just need to figure out what's keeping him." I wasn't sure I believed in ghosts, but I was desperate for answers. We combed through the area, looking for anything that might explain the strange occurrences. That's when we found it. A long-abandoned homestead, hidden deep in the woods. The house was little more than a collapsed frame, overgrown with weeds. But there was an undeniable aura about the place, an oppressive weight that pressed down on me. Inside, we found a child's toy, a carved wooden horse. It was strangely intact, as if time hadn't touched it. David picked it up, his face pale. This must have been Jonah's. The moment he said it, the air grew icy. A soft, eerie laugh echoed through the ruins, and I saw Jonah again. This time, his expression wasn't sad. It was malevolent. His face twisted into something inhuman, and his laughter grew louder, echoing in my ears until I thought I might go mad. David insisted we had to return the toy to the land to put Jonah's spirit to rest. It's the only way, he said, though I wasn't sure if he was trying to convince me or himself. That night, we built a small fire near the homestead. David placed the wooden horse in the flames, and we recited a simple prayer for peace, hoping it would be enough. But it wasn't. The fire roared to life, and Jonah appeared again, no longer a boy, but a monstrous figure. His face a grotesque mask of fury. The ground trembled beneath us, and the air filled with a deafening wail. David screamed as Jonah lunged at him, and I grabbed the only thing I could think of, my recording equipment. I hurled it into the flames, shouting, "Take it all!" The wailing stopped. The fire died down, and Jonah vanished. The forest was silent once more. The next morning, I packed up my RV and left Oak Flat, leaving behind my research and my curiosity. David stayed, determined to learn more, but I knew I couldn't face whatever lingered there. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. It was Jonah, or what was left of him, his hollow eyes fixed on me as I disappeared down the road. I still hear his cries sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet. And I know, deep down, that he's still out there, waiting for the next camper who dares to wander too far. My name is Eleanor Kane, but everyone calls me Ellie. I'm 42 years old, and this happened last October in the Painted Desert of Arizona, near a place called Devil's Wash. I'd gone there alone in my RV to paint landscapes and clear my head. I thought it would be like any other trip, quiet, restorative, uneventful. I was wrong. I should have listened to the warnings. I pulled into the Painted Desert under a blazing midday sun. The place was more beautiful than I could have imagined. The layered red and orange hills stretched as far as the eye could see, like an alien world dropped onto Earth. I parked my RV near a dry wash, a wide, shallow gully carved by ancient floods. It was the perfect spot, isolated, quiet, and with an unobstructed view of the cliffs. At the gas station on my way in, an old man had warned me about the wash. He'd been chewing tobacco, leaning against the counter like he had all the time in the world. "Bad ground," he'd said, narrowing his eyes at me. "Folks lose their minds out there. If they come back, they're not the same." "Why's that?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Desert plays tricks on you," he said, shrugging. "Voices, shadows, things you can't explain. Best stay away." I thanked him, amused but unfazed. I wasn't superstitious. I believed in what I could see, touch, and rationalize. And besides, I wasn't looking for trouble. I just wanted to paint. The first day was peaceful. I set up my easel near the edge of the wash and started sketching. The sun shifted throughout the day, casting the hills in golden light, then dusky purples. I worked until my fingers ached, losing myself in the process. That night, as I sat by the RV with a mug of tea, the desert seemed to stretch endlessly around me. The stars were brighter than I'd ever seen, the silence so deep it felt tangible. But as I gazed out at the wash, I thought I heard something, a faint, melodic hum, like someone singing far away. I dismissed it as the wind playing tricks and went to bed. But my dreams that night were strange. I saw shadowy figures standing in the wash, their faces obscured. They weren't doing anything, just watching. The next morning, I woke up to something even stranger. Footprints in the sand, leading from the wash to the RV. Barefoot, human-sized, and impossibly fresh. My stomach twisted as I inspected them. There'd been no wind, no rain, nothing to explain them. It's just wildlife, I muttered to myself. Nothing to worry about. I tried to focus on painting, but my mind kept drifting back to the footprints. The hum from the night before nagged at me too. Was I imagining things? Or was there something off about this place? The second night, the hum returned. It was louder this time and closer. I couldn't pinpoint its source. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. When I stepped outside with my flashlight, the beam barely seemed to cut the darkness. "Hello?" I called, my voice trembling. The hum stopped. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A flicker of shadow in the wash. My heart pounded as I swung the flashlight toward it, but there was nothing there. Just empty sand and rock. The third day, my unease grew. The desert, which had felt so peaceful at first, now felt oppressive. The air seemed heavier, the silence more sinister. While painting, I spotted a figure standing in the wash, a gaunt man with sunken eyes. He was waving, gesturing for me to come closer. "Hey!" I called out, grabbing my water bottle and jogging toward him. But as I got closer, he vanished. One second he was there, the next he wasn't. In his place, etched into the sand, were strange symbols. Spirals, jagged lines, shapes that seemed almost alive. I knelt to study them, but when I looked up, I felt it again. That sensation of being watched. That night was when things truly fell apart. I was asleep in the RV when I woke up to a low, rhythmic hum. My chest felt heavy, like something was pressing down on me. My first thought was sleep paralysis, but when I opened my eyes, I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing just outside the RV, silhouetted against the faint moonlight. Their forms were shadowy and indistinct, but their eyes glowed faintly, like embers. One of them raised a hand and tapped on the window. I bolted upright, heart racing. But when I turned on the lights and looked again, they were gone. The desert outside was empty, silent. I wanted to leave right then and there, but when I tried to start the RV, the engine wouldn't turn over. The battery was dead. Desperation drove me to the wash the next day. I needed answers, or at least some sign that I wasn't losing my mind. I found it. In a shaded corner of the wash, half hidden by a tumble of rocks, was an ancient petroglyph. It depicted figures bowing to a swirling, shifting form, a mass of jagged lines and spirals, the same shapes I'd seen in the sand. As I stared at it, the air around me seemed to vibrate, like the desert itself was alive. Images flashed through my mind. The gaunt man from the wash, the shadowy figures outside the RV, the glowing eyes, and beneath it all a voice whispered, "Paint me." I stumbled back, my breath coming in gasps. The desert wasn't just playing tricks on me, it was speaking to me. That night, I couldn't resist. Compelled by something I couldn't explain, I set up my easel and began to paint. My hands moved on their own, dragging lines of crimson and black across the canvas. Shapes emerged. Twisted, nightmarish landscapes, shadowy figures. And, at the center of it all, the swirling form from the petroglyph. When I finally stopped, the painting was unlike anything I'd ever created. It pulsed with an energy that felt alive. And then I heard it. The hum, louder than ever. It wasn't outside this time, it was inside my head. The shadows returned, surrounding the RV, their eyes glowing brighter. The hum grew to a deafening roar, and I felt the air crackle with energy. In a last desperate act, I grabbed a can of gasoline and doused the painting. "You can't have me," I screamed, striking a match and tossing it onto the canvas. The flames roared to life, engulfing the painting. The hum turned into a scream, a horrible, inhuman sound that made my ears ring. The shadows writhed and twisted, their forms breaking apart like smoke in the wind. When the fire died down, the desert was silent again. The RV engine roared to life on the first try, and I drove away, not daring to look back. It's been weeks since I left Devil's Wash, but I can't escape it. My dreams are filled with shadows and whispers. And this morning, when I opened my front door, I found something waiting for me. The painting. Burned, blackened, but unmistakably the same. I don't know how it got here, but I know one thing for sure: the desert isn't done with me yet. My name is Mia Sanchez, and I'm 30 years old. This happened in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona last spring on what should have been a straightforward geological survey. I was hired by an ecotourism company to map out a new hiking trail, but what we encountered out there wasn't anything you'd find on a topographical map. I'm still piecing together the details, what was real, what wasn't, but I know this. We walked into a place we shouldn't have, and something there didn't want us to leave. I'd brought my childhood friend Jamie and my intern Liv along for the trip. Jamie was 28, full of reckless energy and loved a good adrenaline rush. Liv, 25, was quieter, a city girl who jumped at every noise. I figured the two of them would balance each other out. Jamie would keep things fun, and Liv would keep us grounded. Turns out, I was wrong. The drive into the Superstitions was long, winding through sun-baked desert roads that seemed to stretch forever. When we finally reached the trailhead, we parked the Jeep, strapped on our gear, and headed into the canyon. I'd been out here before, but this time felt different. Off, somehow. The air was heavier, and the wind seemed to whisper as it moved through the rock formations. Our first night in the canyon, we set up camp near a dry creek bed. Jamie realized he'd left one of our GPS devices back in the car, which earned him a sharp glare from Liv. "Relax," he said with a grin. "We got another one, and maps will be fine." I wasn't so sure. The Superstitions were notorious for their rough terrain, and it wasn't uncommon for people to get lost out here. But Jamie's confidence was infectious, and Liv seemed eager to prove herself, so I let it go. The first signs of trouble came that night. We were sitting around the campfire swapping stories when Liv suddenly froze. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Hear what?" Jamie said, looking around. It sounded like someone saying my name. Jamie laughed, but it wasn't his usual carefree chuckle. "It's just the wind, Liv. Chill." But I'd heard it too. A faint, almost imperceptible sound, like someone calling from far away. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was nothing, but I noticed Liv kept glancing over her shoulder for the rest of the night. The next day, we packed up camp and continued deeper into the canyon. The trail was supposed to be straightforward, but the desert had a way of swallowing landmarks. By mid-afternoon, I realized we were off course. To make matters worse, a storm was rolling in. Dark clouds gathering on the horizon, the kind that could turn dry creek beds into raging rivers in minutes. We scrambled to set up camp as the first drops of rain began to fall. The storm hit hard, pelting us with rain and wind that howled through the canyon. When it finally passed, we found that some of our gear had been washed away, including one of the paper maps. Liv was visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she tried to salvage what was left of her pack. "Great," Jamie muttered. "Now we're down a GPS and a map." "We'll figure it out," I said. trying to keep my voice steady. But as I looked around at the unfamiliar landscape, a knot of unease tightened in my chest. That evening, while exploring the area around our camp, I found something strange. An old, rusted pickaxe buried under a pile of rocks. The handle was covered in strange etchings, symbols I didn't recognize. I showed it to Jamie, who immediately started joking about curses and treasure. Liv didn't find it funny. "We shouldn't be messing with this," she said, her voice edged with fear. "It's just an old tool," I said, though I wasn't entirely convinced. Something about it felt wrong, but Jamie insisted on keeping it, tucking it into his pack with a grin. That night, the whispers came again, louder this time. They seemed to come from all around us, weaving through the trees and rocks. I lay awake in my tent, straining to make out the words, but they were just beyond comprehension. When I finally drifted off, I dreamed of shadowy figures watching us from the ridge, their faces featureless and their limbs impossibly long. In the morning, we found footprints circling our camp. They looked human at first glance, but the toes were too long, and the prints were deeper than they should have been. Jamie laughed it off, saying it was probably a trick of the rain and wind, but Liv was pale and silent. We pressed on, hoping to find our way back to the main trail, but the canyon seemed to twist and shift around us. The landmarks didn't match the map, and the GPS couldn't get a signal. As we climbed a ridge to get a better view, Liv let out a gasp. "There's someone watching us," she whispered, pointing to a shadowy figure in the distance. It was standing on the next ridge over, too far away to make out any details. It didn't move, didn't call out, just stood there, watching. Jamie waved and yelled, but the figure didn't respond. After a few minutes, it simply turned and disappeared behind the ridge. By the time we made camp that night, the tension was palpable. Liv barely spoke, and even Jamie seemed uneasy. As we sat around the fire, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Then, without warning, the fire went out, plunging us into darkness. "Stay close," I said, fumbling for my flashlight. When I finally got it on, the beam landed on something that made my blood run cold. A gaunt, deer-headed figure standing just outside the ring of light. Its movements were jerky and unnatural, like a marionette controlled by an inexperienced puppeteer. Jamie grabbed the flare gun from his pack and fired, but the creature didn't flinch. It just tilted its head, as if studying us before retreating into the shadows. We decided to leave at first light, but the creature, or whatever it was, wasn't done with us. As we packed up camp, it began mimicking our voices, calling out from different directions. At one point, Jamie thought he heard me calling for help and nearly ran off into the trees. I had to grab him to stop him. Then it attacked. We were halfway up the ridge when a boulder came tumbling down, knocking Jamie off his feet. He screamed in pain, clutching his leg, which was bent at an unnatural angle. Liv and I managed to drag him to a small clearing, but the creature was still out there, its shadow flitting between the trees. Liv, who had done some research on Navajo legends before the trip, remembered something about skinwalkers, malevolent shapeshifters that thrived on fear and chaos. "We can't look it in the eye," she said, "and we can't say its name." Using a makeshift stretcher, we carried Jamie back toward the trailhead. The creature followed us the whole way, keeping just out of sight. At one point, it imitated Jamie's voice, begging us to stop and rest. When we ignored it, the whispers turned to screams, horrible, guttural sounds that made my ears ring. By the time we reached the trailhead, the creature seemed to lose interest. It disappeared into the trees, leaving only silence in its wake. But as we loaded Jamie into the Jeep, I noticed something on the rear window, faint, elongated handprints, too large to be human. Jamie survived, but he's not the same. Liv quit the internship and refuses to talk about what happened. As for me, I can't stop thinking about the etchings on that pickaxe and the whispers in the canyon. Sometimes, late at night, I hear them again, faint and distant, calling my name. My name is Caleb Rourke, and I'm 44 years old. This happened in October of 2022 when I was traveling through Arizona in my RV. I wasn't looking for trouble, just a little history, a bit of adventure, and maybe a mystery to unravel. What I found in the Superstition Mountains was something I'll carry with me forever, something I can't escape, even now. I'd been fascinated with the legend of the Lost Dutchman's mine ever since I was a kid. Stories of cursed gold hidden somewhere in the rugged Superstition Mountains had always seemed like a fairy tale for treasure hunters. But as I drove my RV down the dusty road toward a remote campsite near the trailhead to Devil's Roost, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was stepping into one of those legends. Devil's Roost was little more than a jagged outcrop overlooking the wilderness. The name itself carried a weight, a dark allure. I'd read that some old miners believed it was cursed ground, but I chalked it up to superstition. People love a good ghost story, and I wasn't one to scare easily. The campsite was quiet, the kind of isolation I craved after weeks of bouncing between noisy parks and tourist-heavy trails. My RV hummed softly as I set up, and the sinking sun cast long shadows over the mountains. It was perfect until I met her. I was unpacking my gear when Maggie Porter appeared. She was wearing a park ranger's uniform, though it looked more lived-in than official. She had the kind of easy confidence that only comes from spending years in the wilderness. "You planning to hike up there?" she asked, nodding toward the trailhead. "Something like that," I said. "I'm here for the history, maybe see if I can find something interesting." Her expression tightened. "You won't find what you're looking for." I raised an eyebrow. "You don't even know what I'm looking for." "You're not the first to come here chasing gold or stories," she said. "Most don't find anything but trouble." Her tone grated on me, but there was something in her eyes, an edge of fear that gave me pause. "You don't buy into all that cursed gold nonsense, do you?" "It's not nonsense," she said sharply. "People disappear out here. My brother—" She hesitated, glancing toward the mountains. "He went looking for the mine 5 years ago, never came back." I wanted to say something comforting, but she turned and walked off before I could. Her words stayed with me, though, as the shadows deepened and the stars came out. The silence of the superstitions felt heavier than it should, like the mountains themselves were watching me. The next morning, I set out early, my backpack loaded with water, snacks, and my GPS. The trail to Devil's Roost wasn't well marked, but I'd studied the maps and thought I had a good sense of where I was headed. The hike started uneventfully enough. The air was cool, and the smell of sagebrush filled my lungs. But about an hour in, my GPS started acting up. The screen flickered, then went dark altogether. I cursed under my breath and pulled out my phone, only to realize I had no signal, far earlier than I should have lost it. "Just a fluke," I muttered, though unease prickled at the back of my neck. I marked my path with small rocks and kept moving, determined to reach the roost. That's when I saw the pickaxe. It was embedded in a rock near the trail, its handle worn but the metal surprisingly free of rust. Nearby, I found an old leather-bound journal. The pages were brittle, the writing faded, but one phrase stood out, scrawled in uneven letters. "The gold isn't worth it." I felt a chill, but curiosity won out over caution. I stuffed the journal into my pack and kept going. The closer I got to Devil's Roost, the more the landscape seemed to change. The trail narrowed, the trees grew denser, and the air grew colder despite the midday sun. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. At first, it was just a sense of unease, a nagging thought that I wasn't alone. Then I started seeing it. A black, shapeless figure, darting between the trees. Every time I turned to look, it was gone. Just my imagination, I told myself. Too much time reading ghost stories. But as I climbed higher, the figure grew bolder. It lingered at the edge of my vision, its movements unnaturally smooth, like it was gliding rather than walking. I tried to take a photo, but my camera wouldn't focus. The lens glitched, distorting the image until it was useless. By the time I reached Devil's Roost, my nerves were frayed. The outcrop jutted over the wilderness like a jagged scar, and the view was breathtaking. But I couldn't enjoy it. The shadow was closer now, circling me like a predator sizing up its prey. That night, back at my RV, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the vehicle, every rustle of wind against the trees set my heart racing. I finally gave up and started flipping through the journal I'd found. The entries told a fragmented story of a miner who had stumbled upon the lost Dutchman's mine. The gold, he wrote, was cursed. Those who found it were marked by a shadow, bound to guard the treasure for eternity. His last entry read, "It comes at night, I hear it calling, there's no escape." As I read the final words, a knock echoed through the RV. I froze. Another knock followed, louder this time, and I grabbed my flashlight, shining it through the window. A man stood outside, his face pale and gaunt, his clothes filthy and torn. He was holding a pickaxe. "Who are you?" I called, my voice shaking. "The gold," he rasped. "You must leave it." When I blinked, he was gone. The next day, I hiked back to Devil's Roost, determined to put an end to the madness. I didn't know what I was looking for, answers, maybe, or a way to prove the curse was just a story. But as I approached the roost, the shadow reappeared. This time, it didn't stay at the edges of my vision. It loomed before me, a towering, shapeless figure that radiated malice. "You don't scare me," I said, though my voice trembled. The shadow didn't speak, but it moved closer, enveloping me in a cold so intense it felt like my bones were freezing. My flashlight flickered and died, leaving me in darkness. That's when I saw the gold. It glittered faintly in a crevice near the roost, tantalizingly close. The old miner's words echoed in my mind. "The gold isn't worth it." I don't know how long I stood there staring at the gold. The shadow loomed behind me, its presence suffocating. I knew, deep down, that if I touched the gold, I'd be bound to it forever, just like the others. A sudden voice broke the silence. "Caleb!" Maggie appeared, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. She'd followed me, worried after hearing strange static on her radio. The shadow recoiled slightly at the light, and I seized the moment to act. "You need to leave," I told her. "Now!" "I'm not leaving you," she shouted. "There's no time." I grabbed a rock and hurled it into the crevice, burying the gold under a cascade of debris. The shadow howled, a sound so inhuman it made my ears ring. It lunged for me, but Maggie grabbed my arm, pulling me away just in time. We ran, the shadow close behind. Maggie's flashlight flickered, and I felt its cold tendrils brushing against my back. But as we reached the tree line, the shadow stopped, retreating into the darkness as if bound to the roost. We didn't stop running until we reached my RV. The sunrise was just breaking over the horizon, bathing the forest in light. The shadow was gone, but the memory of it lingered. I left the Superstition Mountains that day, leaving the cursed trailhead behind. Maggie and I didn't speak much on the way back, but her presence was a comfort. She told me she'd file a report about the area, but we both knew no one would believe us. As I drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw the shadow standing at the edge of the forest, watching me, I know now that some mysteries aren't meant to be solved, and some treasures are better left buried. My name is Anna Harper, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in September of 2022 when I decided to take a solo camping trip in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest in Arizona. I thought I was prepared, physically, mentally, and emotionally. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered. I'm a photographer, mostly landscapes and wildlife. I left my corporate job earlier that year craving freedom and the chance to chase my passion full-time. That's how I ended up driving my RV into the heart of the Apache Sitgreaves, chasing the promise of solitude and a portfolio-worthy sunrise over its pine-covered hills. The forest was endless, stretching across the horizon like a green sea interrupted only by jagged ridges and a cobalt sky. I parked at a remote trailhead marked Reed Point, a place not listed on the official maps. Locals whispered about Reed Point, calling it cursed. I dismissed the rumors as old ghost stories, until they weren't. The first person I met was Jake Hayes, a wiry man in his late 40s, with deep lines etched into his face and a quiet, watchful demeanor. I'd just parked my RV and was unloading my gear when he approached from the trail, his backpack slung over one shoulder. "You camping out here?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly. "Yeah," I said, offering a polite smile. "I'm a photographer, looking for some good shots of the forest." His eyes narrowed. "You picked the wrong spot. This area's different." Different how? Hard to explain. Just don't wander off the trails, and if you hear voices, don't follow them. He adjusted his pack and glanced at the tree line. "Be careful." Before I could ask more, he disappeared down the trail, leaving me with his cryptic warning and a growing sense of unease. I shook it off, blaming it on his grizzled demeanor. People love to scare tourists, I told myself. I set up camp about a mile from the trailhead, deep enough to avoid other hikers but not too far from my RV. The forest was alive with the sounds of nature. Birds chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional scampering of unseen creatures. It was perfect. As night fell, I cooked a simple dinner over a small fire and reviewed the photos I'd taken during the day. They were breathtaking. Tall pines stretching toward the sky, their silhouettes stark against the setting sun. That's when I heard it. A faint whistle, high-pitched and melodic, coming from the forest. It wasn't a bird or the wind. It was human. I froze, every muscle tensed. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding too loud in the stillness. No answer. Just the whistle, growing softer, as if it were retreating deeper into the woods. The next morning, I was packing my gear for a hike when I heard someone shouting for help. A young woman stumbled into my campsite, her face pale and her breath coming in ragged gasps. "Please," she said, clutching her side. "I got lost. I've been walking all night." Her name was Bethany Lowell. She was 21, a college student hiking with friends when she took a wrong turn and became separated from her group. Her relief at finding my campsite was palpable, but there was something in her eyes, something haunted. "Why were you walking all night?" I asked as I handed her a water bottle. "I heard something. It wasn't an animal." She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting to see someone standing behind her. It sounded like my friend Kara, but it wasn't her. I know it wasn't. Bethany stayed close to me as I hiked that day, clearly too shaken to venture off alone. I didn't mind the company, though I couldn't shake the growing sense that we weren't truly alone in the forest. It started with small things. First, the trail seemed to shift. I'd marked my route with small ribbons tied to branches, but some were missing, and others appeared in places I hadn't been. Then there were the totems, strange carvings, humanoid in shape, hanging from trees at random intervals. They hadn't been there the day before. "What is this?" Bethany whispered, staring at one of the grotesque figures. Its face was elongated, its limbs twisted in unnatural angles. "Probably some kind of folk art," I said, though my voice lacked conviction. That night, back at the campsite, I reviewed the day's photos. One shot, a panoramic of the forest, made my stomach drop. Among the trees, barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. Tall and skeletal, with glowing eyes that seemed to burn into the lens. Jake appeared at my campsite again the next day, emerging from the trees like a ghost. His face was grim as he took in Bethany and the unease written across both our faces. "You should leave," he said without preamble. "What is going on?" I demanded, showing him the photo. "Do you know what this is?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Skinwalker," he said finally. "A shapeshifter, an old legend, but real enough in these woods. They can mimic voices, faces, lure you away." Bethany looked ready to cry. "What do we do?" "Stay together. Don't let it separate you, and don't trust what you hear." That night, the forest turned hostile. It began with noises, branches snapping, low growls that seemed to come from all sides. Then came the voices. "Bethany!" A voice called from the darkness, soft and pleading. It was identical to Bethany's voice. She froze, clutching my arm. That's me," she whispered. Jake lit a fire, his movements swift and sure. "Stay close to the flames. It hates fire." The figure emerged at the edge of the firelight, its skeletal frame impossibly tall, its glowing eyes fixed on us. It moved with jerky, unnatural motions, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. Jake grabbed a makeshift torch and stepped toward it, shouting something in a language I didn't recognize. The creature recoiled but didn't retreat. It lunged, faster than anything I'd ever seen. Jake shoved me aside, swinging the torch as its claws raked his chest. He screamed, falling to the ground. Bethany and I ran for the RV, slamming the door behind us. The creature scratched and pounded against the metal, its distorted voice calling our names. Through the window, I saw Jake's body lying motionless near the dying fire. At dawn, the creature was gone, leaving only claw marks on the RV and the eerie silence of the forest. Bethany and I drove out of the forest, our nerves shattered. I couldn't shake the image of Jake's lifeless body or the creature's glowing eyes. I still see them sometimes in my dreams, or in the shadows of the trees when I'm out photographing. And I know one thing for certain. There's something in the Apache Sitgreaves that defies explanation. Something ancient, something evil. My name is Rowan Hart, and I'm 27 years old. This happened last summer in the Apache Sitgreaves National Forest, Arizona. I was on a solo trip in my RV, documenting nocturnal wildlife for a conservation project. I've always thought of myself as rational and logical, someone who doesn't spook easily. But that trip, it changed everything I thought I knew. The forest greeted me with an overwhelming stillness as I drove deep into its heart. The road narrowed into a dirt path flanked by towering pines, their branches forming a shadowy canopy. It was the kind of place that felt untouched, almost sacred. My RV came to a stop at a secluded campsite near a small clearing. This was where I'd spend the next 4 nights, photographing owls, bats, and whatever else stirred in the dark. As I stepped out, the air smelled of pine and earth, clean and sharp. The quiet was disconcerting. No bird calls, no rustling leaves, just a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. I brushed it off. Nature had its own rhythms, after all. The first sign of something unusual came that evening. I had just set up my camera trap when I noticed a faint glow in the distance. It was bluish-green, hovering low among the trees like a will-o'-the-wisp. My curiosity piqued. I'd heard of bioluminescent fungi, but I'd never seen anything quite like this. I snapped a few photos, the light casting eerie shadows across the forest floor. When I checked the pictures later in the RV, something about them unsettled me. The light appeared sharper in the photos, almost artificial, and in one frame it seemed to twist into a vague shape, like a figure crouching behind a tree. I told myself it was a trick of the light. The next day, I drove to a nearby village to pick up supplies. At a tiny general store, I struck up a conversation with the shopkeeper, an older woman named Nina. She had dark, sharp eyes that seemed to see right through me. "You camping alone out there?" she asked, her tone almost accusatory. "Yeah," I replied. "I'm a wildlife researcher." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting out the window toward the forest. "You've seen the lights, haven't you?" I froze. "The lights?" "Which lights?" she said, leaning closer. "They've been in these woods for as long as anyone can remember. Beautiful, but dangerous. They'll call to you, lead you deeper in. People go missing, you know." I laughed nervously. "You mean like folklore? Ghost stories?" She didn't laugh back. Instead, she rummaged behind the counter and pulled out a small pouch tied with twine. "Take this," she said. "It's a charm. If the lights come for you, stay in your circle. Don't follow them." I hesitated, but took it. The pouch smelled faintly of sage and something bitter. As I left, I tried to shake off her warning. Superstition, I thought, nothing more. That night, I set up my equipment as usual. The forest had grown colder, the air carrying a faint metallic tang that made me shiver. Around midnight, I heard it, the faintest whispering, like wind moving through a narrow crack. I stepped outside the RV, scanning the darkness with my flashlight. The witch light had returned. This time, it was closer, flickering just beyond the tree line. As I watched, it pulsed brighter, almost invitingly, and I thought I heard my own voice, soft, distant, calling my name. "Rowan!" I stumbled back, my heart racing. My rational mind kicked in. Sound can carry weirdly in forests, I told myself. It's just an animal or the wind. But the whisper came again, clearer now. "Rowan, come see." I slammed the RV door shut and locked it. Inside, I clutched Nina's charm, the twine rough against my fingers. The whispers faded, but the light didn't leave. It hovered outside, casting its glow against the windows. I didn't sleep that night. By the third night, exhaustion and frustration were getting to me. The witch light returned, brighter than ever, flickering just outside my campsite. I convinced myself it was some kind of natural phenomenon. Phosphorescent gases, maybe. Determined to prove it, I grabbed my camera and stepped into the woods. The light retreated as I approached, moving deeper into the forest. My boots crunched on the pine needles as I followed, snapping pictures every few steps. The light seemed almost playful, darting between trees, pausing just long enough for me to catch a glimpse. But the deeper I went, the more the forest changed. The trees grew denser, their trunks gnarled and twisted as if they were writhing in pain. The air grew heavy, each breath harder to draw. I turned to head back, only to realize I didn't recognize my surroundings. That's when I saw the shadows. They were faint at first, barely more than blurs against the trees. But as the witchlight pulsed, they grew clearer. Humanoid shapes, shifting and swaying as if caught in a slow rhythmic dance. Their heads tilted toward me, and I felt their gaze like a physical weight. Panic surged. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. and the shadows surged closer. The witch light flickered erratically, and for the first time I felt its malevolence. It wasn't just a light, it was alive, aware, and it wanted me. I ran. The forest seemed to close in around me as I fled, the shadows keeping pace. My flashlight beam wavered, illuminating glimpses of clawed hands and hollow faces. The whispers returned, louder now, overlapping in a cacophony of voices. "Stay! Stay!" Nina's warning rang in my head. The charm, I fumbled it out of my pocket and clutched it tightly, muttering a prayer to no one in particular. The pouch warmed in my hand, and the whispers faltered. Ahead, I saw a faint glow. Not the witch light, something softer, warmer. My RV. I sprinted toward it, my lungs burning, and threw myself inside. The moment I crossed the threshold, the shadows stopped. They lingered just beyond the clearing, their forms flickering like dying embers. The witchlight appeared again, slamming against the windows with a soundless fury. I scrambled to light a bundle of sage from Nina's pouch. The smoke curling into the air, the light recoiled, its glow dimming, and for the first time, I thought I heard it scream. The light vanished just before dawn, leaving the forest eerily quiet once more. I didn't wait to pack up. I drove straight back to the village, desperate to thank Nina for her charm and warn her about what I'd seen. But when I arrived, her shop was empty. The windows were shuttered, and a weathered "For Sale" sign hung on the door. A neighbor told me she'd moved away years ago. When I developed my photos later, I found them unnerving. The witch light appeared in every frame, its glow almost too bright to look at. In the final shot, taken as I fled, it hovered just outside the RV, and reflected in its light was a face, a woman's face, pale and twisted in rage. I haven't been back to the forest since, but sometimes, in the dead of night, I dream of the witchlight. It whispers my name, promising we'll meet again. My name is Liam Harker, and I'm 35 years old. This happened 2 years ago while I was traveling through northern Arizona in my RV. As a freelance photographer, I'd made it a habit to chase desolate, forgotten places for my portfolio, but this time, I chased something I'll never forget and wish I never found. The trip started like many others. My goal was Canyon Diablo, a ghost town with a reputation as one of the most lawless places of the Old West. I'd heard stories about its violent history, outlaws, lynchings, massacres. It sounded perfect. An eerie, abandoned place that would make for striking photographs. My RV was packed with gear, and I planned to spend the night parked near the ruins. I arrived late afternoon. The canyon stretched vast and jagged, the landscape harsh and barren. The ruins of Canyon Diablo sat near the edge, crumbling wooden structures that leaned like drunkards, their beams gray with age. As I set up my tripod to capture the fading sunlight, the wind howled through the empty streets like a mournful spirit. That's when I saw her. A figure on the road in the distance, walking toward me. She was barefoot, her clothes dusty and tattered, and her hair hung in wild tangles. I called out, but she didn't respond, just kept walking toward the ruins. My stomach turned, though I couldn't say why. She didn't look injured, just wrong, like she didn't belong here. I snapped a few pictures, my hands trembling slightly. The light was fading fast, so I packed up my gear and headed back to the RV, still thinking about the strange woman. As I sat reviewing the day's photos, my breath caught in my throat. In every shot of the ruins, she was there. In one, she stood in a doorway, staring directly at the camera, though I'd never seen her stop walking. Her face was pale, her eyes empty. I should have left then, but I didn't. The lure of the unknown kept me there. That night, as I lay in bed, I was startled awake by a faint knock at the RV door. My heart thudded in my chest. It was nearly midnight, and I hadn't seen another soul for miles. The knock came again, soft but deliberate. Grabbing my flashlight, I peered out the window. There she was, standing in the pale moonlight, her bare feet planted in the dirt. Her head tilted slightly, and her expression was unreadable. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice low and monotone. Every instinct screamed at me to say no, but instead, I opened the door. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" I asked. She stepped inside without answering. Up close, she looked even stranger. Her skin was chalky, almost translucent, and her clothes, some kind of old-fashioned dress, were covered in dust and fraying at the edges. She sat down on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor. "I need a ride," she said finally, her voice so soft I had to strain to hear it. "To the end of the canyon." "The end of the canyon," I repeated, confused. "There's nothing there." Her head snapped up, and for the first time, her empty eyes met mine. "Please." Against my better judgment, I agreed. I couldn't shake the feeling that something about her wasn't right, but curiosity got the better of me. I started the RV and pulled onto the dirt road leading deeper into the canyon. For a while, she said nothing. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, staring out the window as the desert stretched on in eerie silence. Then, she began to speak. "They took everything from me," she murmured. "My life, my family, my name." "Who did?" I asked, glancing at her. "The others," she said. Her voice trembled, but she didn't elaborate. "They're still here." I didn't know what to say, so I drove in silence. The road grew rougher, the RV bouncing over jagged rocks and uneven terrain. My GPS, which had been unreliable since I arrived, finally gave up completely, its screen frozen on a blank map. The headlights caught something on the roadside, a cluster of wooden crosses sticking out of the ground. Grave markers. Some were broken, their inscriptions worn away by time. My skin prickled. The further we went, the stranger things became. Shapes flickered at the edge of the headlights, shadowy figures that vanished as soon as I turned to look at them. The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a weight. "They're watching," the woman whispered. I gripped the wheel tighter. "Who's watching?" She didn't answer, just pointed ahead. The road had narrowed into a rocky path that climbed a steep incline. Reluctantly, I pressed on, though every nerve in my body screamed at me to turn around. As we reached the top, the RV stalled. The engine sputtered and died, leaving us in complete darkness. I cursed under my breath and turned the key, but the engine wouldn't start. "They're here," the woman said, her voice trembling. My flashlight beam cut through the dark, landing on the road ahead. Shadows were gathering, moving toward us in an unnatural glide. There were dozens of them, faceless humanoid forms that seemed to absorb the light. "What the hell are those?" I whispered. She didn't answer. Instead, she opened the door and stepped out. "Stay here," she said. "No, wait." Before I could stop her, the shadows swarmed her. They moved like smoke, wrapping around her body as she screamed. Her voice was a raw, piercing sound that echoed through the canyon. Then, she was gone. I sat there in stunned silence, my mind struggling to process what I'd just seen. The shadows turned toward the RV, their empty faces fixed on me. I grabbed my camera out of instinct and began snapping photos, the flash cutting through the dark. For a moment, they hesitated, as if the light had disrupted them, but it didn't last. They surged forward, closing in on the RV. Desperate, I grabbed my keys and turned them in the ignition. This time, the engine roared to life. I slammed on the gas, the tires skidding on the rocky road as I sped back toward the ruins. The shadows followed, their shapes darting alongside the RV, their fingers clawing at the windows. I didn't stop until I reached the ghost town. The moment I crossed into its boundaries, the shadows stopped. They lingered at the edge of the ruins, their forms flickering like dying flames. Then, one by one, they faded into the night. I parked near the old jailhouse and stumbled inside, my heart pounding. The building smelled of rot and decay, but it felt safe compared to the open desert. In the corner, I found an old newspaper clipping pinned to the wall. The headline read, "Massacre at Canyon Diablo, 12 dead in violent raid." Scanning the article, I froze when I saw her face, a grainy black and white photo of the woman who had entered my RV. The caption identified her as Sarah Wilkes, a victim of the raid. She had been killed over a century ago. By the time dawn broke, the shadows were gone, and the canyon was quiet again. I made my way back to the RV and drove away, my hands trembling on the wheel. When I developed the photos later, I found her in every shot. In the last frame, taken just before the engine restarted, she stood among the shadows, her face filled with a mixture of sorrow and terror. I never returned to Canyon Diablo, but every so often I dream of her, standing barefoot in the moonlight, her empty eyes staring into mine, as if waiting for me to finish what we started. My name is Jason Cross, and I'm 32 years old. This happened in late October, during a 3-day hiking trip to the Mogollon Rim in Arizona. I had organized the trip to reconnect with some old friends, but nothing could have prepared me for the nightmare we walked into. We set off on a crisp Friday morning, the kind where the chill bites just enough to make you appreciate the sun. I was leading the group, a role I'd grown into over years of camping and hiking. My companions were Maya, Lila, and Ethan, all friends from college who hadn't seen each other in years. This trip was supposed to be a reunion of sorts, a chance to bond over campfires and trails. But, as I'd soon learn, the wilds of the Mogollon Rim had other plans. The first day was uneventful. Maya, 28, was the newbie in the group, a little awkward but eager to prove herself. Lila, 30, was our self-proclaimed paranormal expert, always quick with a ghost story. And Ethan, 29, was the skeptic, the guy who found humor in everything and wasn't shy about making his doubts known. The trail to a place called The Hollow was supposed to be well marked, but within an hour, Maya's backpack strap snapped. I redistributed her gear among us, brushing off her apologies. "It's fine," I said. "These things happen." By midday, my GPS started glitching. The trail markers we'd been following seemed to grow sparse, then vanish entirely. Ethan made snide remarks about my top-tier navigation skills, but I trusted my map and compass. The rim was vast, but it wasn't uncharted. Still, the growing unease I felt was hard to ignore. That night, we set up camp near a clearing, just as the sun dipped below the horizon. Lila, as expected, launched into a story about the skinwalker legends tied to the Mogollon Rim. According to her, they were shapeshifters that could mimic voices and appearances to lure their prey. Ethan rolled his eyes, cracking jokes about coyote impersonators, but Maya seemed genuinely spooked. "I'm just saying," Lila concluded, "if you hear someone calling your name out here, it might not be someone you want to meet." We laughed nervously, and I poked the fire, feeding it a fresh log. The night grew colder as the wind rustled through the pines. Then we heard it. Soft, faint laughter carried on the breeze. "That's just coyotes," I said quickly, but even as I spoke I felt a prickle of unease. Maya huddled closer to the fire and Lila's face lit up with excitement. "See, I told you this place was perfect." Perfect wasn't the word I'd have chosen. The next morning, we broke camp and set off early. The forest was still, almost unnaturally so. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, just silence, heavy and oppressive. Around midday, Lila stopped abruptly. "Do you see that?" she whispered, pointing ahead. I followed her gaze and spotted it too, a figure moving between the trees, about 100 yards ahead. It was brief, a flash of tattered clothing disappearing behind a trunk. My heart jumped, but I told myself it was just another hiker. When we reached the spot, though, we found no sign of anyone. No footprints, no movement, just a torn piece of cloth hanging from a low branch. "That's creepy," Maya muttered. Ethan snorted. "Or someone's wardrobe malfunction. Let's keep moving." By the second night, tensions were running high. The trail was becoming harder to follow, and even I was struggling to navigate. We set up camp near a rocky outcrop, exhausted and irritable. Ethan had been pushing my buttons all day, questioning every decision I made. "Maybe we're lost because Captain Compass here can't admit he's wrong," he said, throwing his pack to the ground. "Enough," I snapped. "We're not lost, we're just off track." Maya stayed quiet, but I could see the worry in her eyes. Lila tried to lighten the mood, but even she seemed shaken. That night, the forest came alive with whispers. At first, I thought it was the wind. Then the voices grew louder, clearer, too human to be natural. "Help," one voice moaned, soft and desperate. Another echoed it, then another, overlapping until they became a cacophony. One of them was Maya's voice, sobbing, begging for help. Maya was right beside me, clutching her knees to her chest. "That's not me," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Everyone stay here," I said, grabbing my flashlight and stepping out of the tent. The voices stopped as soon as I was outside. The fire flickered weakly, casting long, warped shadows across the trees. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my grip, scanning the darkness. Nothing moved, but I felt watched. When I returned to the tent, the others were wide-eyed, silent. Ethan finally spoke. "What the hell is going on, Jason?" By the third day, the unease had turned into full-blown dread. The forest seemed to twist around us, the trees forming shapes that felt wrong, bent at impossible angles, their branches clawing at the sky. When we reached the hollow, the supposed highlight of our trip, it was a desolate, eerie expanse. The rocks were scarred with deep grooves, as if some massive creature had clawed them. Worse, the path down was blocked by a fallen tree that hadn't been there minutes before. "Let's turn back," Maya said, her voice shaking. "I don't care about the view." We were debating our options when the air around us grew heavy. Then we heard it. Maya's voice, calling for help from deep within the forest. She froze. "That's me." Lila grabbed her arm. "Don't move, it's trying to lure you." Maya looked at me, her eyes wide with terror. What if it's a real person? What if someone's actually... Before I could stop her, she bolted toward the voice. "Maya, wait!" I shouted, chasing after her. We found her in a small clearing, standing frozen. Ahead of her, barely illuminated by the fading light, was a figure. Its shape was wrong, too tall, too thin, its limbs bent at odd angles. It wore a tattered shirt and jeans, but its face was hollow, its eyes black pits that seemed to swallow the light. It smiled, its mouth stretching unnaturally wide, and spoke in Maya's voice. "Help me." I grabbed Maya's arm and pulled her back. The creature stepped closer, its movements jerky, as if it didn't quite know how to use its limbs. Lila fumbled with her pack, pulling out a bundle of sage and a lighter. "Burn this," she yelled, shoving it into my hands. The flames caught, and the smoke billowed out, sharp and acrid. The creature hesitated, its hollow eyes narrowing. It let out a low guttural growl that made my blood run cold, then retreated into the shadows. We ran. By the time we made it back to camp, Ethan was panicking. "What the hell was that thing? What did you see?" Before I could answer, we heard movement again. This time, it was fast, circling us. The firelight flickered, casting fleeting glimpses of the creature as it darted between the trees. "It's not going to stop," Lila said, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." As we packed up in a frenzy, Ethan bolted. He ran into the darkness, ignoring our shouts to stay together. Then the forest erupted with his screams. We didn't go after him. The three of us stumbled down an unmarked trail, guided only by desperation. When we finally saw the ranger station, it felt like a mirage. We staggered inside, collapsing in relief as the sun rose behind us. Maya cried softly, clutching her knees. Lila stared out the window, clutching her sage. And me? I just sat there, feeling the weight of Ethan's death, of my failure as a leader. As we drove away, I glanced back at the trees. Standing among them was Ethan, his face pale, his mouth twisted into that same unnaturally wide smile. I haven't gone back to the Mogollon Rim since. My name is Carla Rains, and I was 33 years old when this happened. It was early November, and the Arizona air was already sharp with winter's bite. I was alone, as I preferred to be, traveling in my RV to a place called Shadow Lake in the Kaibab National Forest. I'd read about it in an old blog post, a forgotten, haunted lake with a tragic past. As a photojournalist, I lived for places like this, isolated, eerie, full of atmosphere, the kind of place that made for award-winning images and unforgettable stories. I didn't believe in ghosts, not really, but I'd always loved chasing the myths. I reached the lake just before sunset. My RV creaked to a halt in a small clearing near the water's edge, and I stepped out, the cold wind biting at my cheeks. The lake was beautiful in its stillness, surrounded by towering pines that seemed to trap the mist against the water. It felt like stepping into another world, one untouched by time. I spent the first hour walking the shoreline, taking photos of the golden light hitting the misty surface. There was a quiet here that felt unnatural. No birds, no insects, just the soft lapping of water against the rocks. Still, I told myself it was perfect, too perfect. As darkness fell, I set up camp. My RV was my home on wheels, complete with a small kitchenette, a bed, and enough battery power to keep my equipment running. I settled in for the night, reviewing the day's photos on my laptop, when a knock startled me. The knock wasn't on the RV door. It came from outside against the metal siding. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. I hadn't seen another soul for miles. Grabbing a flashlight, I opened the door and stepped out. An old man stood by the lake, his figure barely visible in the dim glow of my flashlight. His face was weathered, his clothes mismatched and layered for warmth. He held a gnarled walking stick in one hand. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice rough and low. "Excuse me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just camping." He shook his head. "The children don't like visitors." I blinked, unsure if I'd heard him correctly. "Children?" He stepped closer, his face illuminated now. "They drowned here years ago. Now they roam the lake, looking for company. They'll call to you. Don't answer them." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees. I called out after him, but he didn't stop. His warning left me shaken, though I told myself it was just a local trying to scare an outsider. That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't sleep. The silence was too complete, as though the forest itself were holding its breath. Around midnight, I heard it. soft, lilting laughter drifting across the water. My stomach clenched, but I forced myself to stay in bed. It's the wind, I told myself, just the wind. The next morning, I stepped out of the RV with my camera, eager to distract myself with work. But as I approached the shore, I froze. Tiny, wet footprints trailed from the water's edge up to my RV. They were small, like those of a child, and they stopped abruptly just outside the door. I scanned the area, my heart racing. There was no one else around, and the forest was still blanketed in mist. The old man's warning echoed in my mind, but I shook it off. It had to be a prank. Maybe he'd done it himself to scare me. I spent the day photographing the lake and its surroundings, though I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every so often, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye, a flicker of white against the dark trees. But when I turned, nothing was there. That evening, as I reviewed my photos, I noticed something strange. In one image, taken near the shore, a faint figure stood in the background. It was blurry, but unmistakable. A little girl in a white dress, standing barefoot at the water's edge. I rubbed my eyes and looked again. The figure wasn't there in the next frame. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stepped outside to check my equipment. That's when I saw her. She stood by the lake, her pale dress fluttering in the breeze. Her hair was long and dark, obscuring her face. She didn't move. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The girl turned slowly, her face partially hidden by shadows. She didn't speak, but her gaze seemed to pierce through me. I wanted to go to her, to ask if she was lost, but something held me back. A primal instinct warning me to stay away. Without a word, she turned and walked into the trees, disappearing as suddenly as she'd appeared. That night, the laughter returned, louder now, accompanied by faint splashing sounds. I pulled the covers over my head, willing it to stop, but the sounds only grew more distinct. Then came the singing. It was soft, melodic, and haunting, like a lullaby carried on the wind. I couldn't make out the words, but the sound filled me with an overwhelming sadness. Against my better judgment, I got out of bed and peered out the window. The girl was back, standing in the shallow water, her dress soaked. She tilted her head as if beckoning me. For a moment, I was tempted to go to her, to step into the water and join her. But then I remembered the footprints, the laughter, the old man's warning. I slammed the curtains shut and climbed back into bed, forcing myself to stay put until morning. By the third night, I was ready to leave. My nerves were frayed, and the lake felt more oppressive with each passing hour. But as I packed up my equipment, my laptop suddenly died, taking my photos with it. My camera, fully charged that morning, refused to turn on. Frustrated, I decided to spend one last night, hoping to salvage my work in the morning. That decision nearly cost me my life. The laughter started just after sunset, followed by the sound of small hands banging against the RV. It came from all sides, a cacophony of giggles and pounding that made my skin crawl. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the door, shouting into the darkness. The noises stopped instantly, and then I saw them. Dozens of children stood by the lake, their faces pale and expressionless. Their eyes reflected the moonlight, glowing faintly. In the center of the group was the girl in white, Eleanor, I realized. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate. "Come play with us," she said, her voice soft and chilling. I stumbled back into the RV, slamming the door shut. The pounding resumed, the walls shaking as if they were trying to break in. The temperature inside dropped, my breath visible in the air. And then, everything went silent. I turned to find Eleanor standing in the RV, though I hadn't seen her enter. She looked at me with sorrowful eyes. "They're angry," she whispered. "You shouldn't have stayed." I stared at her, my mind racing. What do they want? "To take you to the lake," she said, "like they took me." Her form flickered, becoming translucent. "You have to leave. Now." "But my photos, there's no time," she cried, her voice echoing unnaturally. "Run." I didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing my keys, I started the RV and threw it into gear. As I sped down the narrow trail, the children appeared in the trees, their faces glowing in the darkness. Their laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted, until it sounded like the howling of wind through a canyon. When I finally reached the main road, the laughter stopped. The silence was deafening. I didn't stop driving until I reached a small diner on the edge of town. Shaking, I reviewed my remaining photos, desperate to prove to myself that it wasn't all in my head. Most of them were corrupted, distorted beyond recognition. Except one. In the final image, taken by the lake, Eleanor stood in the center of the frame, surrounded by the ghostly forms of the other children. Their faces were twisted into expressions of anger and sadness, their eyes fixed on the camera. I deleted the photo, but it didn't erase the memory. I haven't returned to Shadow Lake. I haven't told anyone what happened either. Some places are meant to be left alone, and some spirits don't want to be disturbed.